where on my website a lot of the information is, so you might want that. All right. So, male female differences is one of my very, very favorite aspects of brain function. Because, in case you didn't know it, our brains are very different. And we get into trouble in relationships due to expectations. So, if you expect that your brain as a male is anything like the brain of a female, or vice versa, you are deluded. And we'll get into trouble with expectations. I was doing this presentation not too long ago, and somebody said to me, a man, if I understand this information, will somehow the differences disappear? And I said, you have to be a very creative designer. No, they won't disappear. But if you understand them and change your expectations, the differences can be holistic and they can be lots of fun. I really have fun with the differences. So, this is pretty new information, certainly new since I've been here, about something called connectomes. And I hope you have as much fun with it as I do. Some of you have done brain benders before. Do you remember those? Anybody have done those before? Well, these are anti-aging puzzles because with your left hemisphere, you are reading the words. And with your right hemisphere, you're looking at the position of the words in the box, because each box is its own puzzle, or the relationship of the words to each other. And your brain should be able to come up with some little phrase that this represents. There are hundreds of these on my website. You could get your 10 minutes of really stimulating puzzles every day free by solving these. So, who's never done these before? Well, a few of you. All right. Well, once you've done them once, your brain is already laying out a piece of software in case you want to do it again, which is the reason you need to be really careful what you do once, because your brain will already be laying out the software just in case you want to do it again, and it will be easier and easier and easier. All right, let's go. Top left. What would this stand for? The word is brain and right brain. There you go. How about this one? The word is life. Brain doesn't care if it goes forwards or backwards. And where is it in the box? What's another word for down? Another word? Low. Low life. And how about this one? Flying high. Good. And how about this one? Standing where? On one foot. Good. You're fast. How about this one? High jinks. Good. What about this one? Just where? Could be just right. What else? Just around what? The corner. Good. Just around the corner. How about this one? Wrinkles where? What's this word? Shirt. Wrinkles where? On your shirt. And this one? This word is flowing. So river is overflowing. Good. See how you do them? Now you can go to the website and you can solve a lot of them. And it's very, very good for your brain. So, how many boxes do you see? Okay, if you look at it one way, it's definitely 6. Good. Now look at it the other way and you see how many more? Has your brain flipped it for you? Okay. So you see the first way you looked at it when there's 6, you see the white block on top, the white side on top. But when you stare at it for a few minutes, your brain will go, "Okay, I've seen it that way. How else can I look at this?" And it will flip it for you, and I have not touched the remote. But this time, the white is on the bottom of the box. Can you see that? So then there's, let's see if I can count them. Should be at least 15 by the time you count them all up. And those are good puzzles for your brain as well. Although people sometimes think there's something voodoo-ish going on here. No, it's just your brain, in particular the right frontal lobe, because it gets bored quickly. Okay, I've seen that. Wonder if there's any other way I can look at it. And there is. And that can happen a lot in life. Conflict is expensive, and you all know that. In your home, it contributes to all kinds of things. Just a few of them are stress, illness, disease, violence, addictions, divorce, and murder. And we hear about this fairly regularly on the news. Many, many murders are committed by somebody who is very well known to the person who was the victim. In schools and churches, it burns out personnel, especially pastors, and triggers all kinds of misunderstandings, which goes back to expectations again. You know, many times a membership will expect the minister to solve their problems when they go in and talk to him. That's not the minister's role. It's your job to solve your problems. The minister can maybe give you some ideas of things to look at, but the expectation cannot be that another person is going to solve your problem. 50% statistically of all the problems we face as human beings are of our own making based on the way we think. And to cause a problem for ourselves because of the way we think and then expect somebody else to solve it is nuts. And in the workplace, 1996, the study was done where managers spent 9% of their time trying to manage employee conflicts. And the owners of businesses are not happy with that. Why should I pay you to be a manager and you're spending 9% of the time that you should be working on the organization just managing employee conflicts? And they thought that was bad enough. They repeated it in 2006. It's now 18% of the time. That's almost a fifth of the time managers spend just on employee conflicts. Well, goes back a long time. This is the earliest cartoon I could find. This was in Punch magazine in England in 1853, and these two gentlemen are having a conflict. And it's pretty much just escalated since then. Two main contributors to conflict. The first one is low levels of emotional intelligence. We haven't talked about emotional intelligence, have we? We probably ought to do that sometime, because your level of emotional intelligence is the number one predictor of how successful you will be in life and in relationships. 80% of your success formula is due to your emotional intelligence, to only 20% to IQ. So what we have found in large sample studies is that successful managers, and you can do that in any way you want, successful ministers, successful teachers, successful managers in business, tend to have high levels of emotional intelligence, while less successful managers often have pretty high IQs, but pretty low emotional intelligence. Sometimes I think of jobs and all the wonderful things he did for the computer industry, but his level of EQ wasn't terribly high when you look at all the problems he was involved with. So there are 3 key behaviors that represent low emotional intelligence. I call them JOT behaviors. Jumping to conclusions, overreacting, and taking things personally. And if you want to raise your EQ, and all of us can keep raising it, the sky is the limit, this is where I started with JOT behaviors. You want to get them out of your life. But the second main contributor to conflict is misunderstanding male-female differences, especially male-female brain differences. And you can do something about both of these. You can raise your EQ, and you can learn about cross-gender differences and figure out how to deal with them. And of the two, this one is the most fun. Male-female differences in brain function. All right, this is what I call the Who I Am pyramid. And it shows the 5 types of brain function that I think every individual needs to know about him or herself in order to be successful. And you notice that the first layer of the pyramid is gender differences. Do you have an empathizing brain or a systemizing brain or a 50-50 brain? And were you born and raised on the eastern part of this planet or the western part? Because where you grew up made a difference in the way your brain developed. So if you're looking for a whole brain solution to something, you really want people from the east part of the planet and the west part of the planet. But it seems like there's a lot of disconnect between the way people raised in the eastern part of the planet think related to the people who are raised in the western side of the planet. But it's all about understanding. So male-female differences are here to stay. John Gray, you may remember, wrote the book Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus. He and I went to the same graduate school for my first PhD, and we talked a lot about at the university male-female differences. So you can collaborate and have fun with them, or you can be frustrated and miserable. I think the saddest thing that's ever happened to me in terms of professional speaking is when I did a rather large weekend seminar for couples. And we spent the whole weekend talking about male-female differences. And I'll bet you a dozen people came up to me and said, wow, I didn't know that was just a male-female difference. I thought there was something wrong with my partner. If I'd known this, I would never have gotten divorced. That's pretty sad. So this is some of the latest, and I have fun with it. When researchers study something, they want large sample studies. And so long before we had brain scans, which we'll be talking about, brain imaging techniques, they were always testing, comparing men and women to the best of their ability. And they were doing it through surveys, and they were doing it through observation. And they were noticing a lot of differences between the two. And the theory was our brains are pretty much the same. It's just, what culture you were raised in and what you were taught, that's what makes the difference. No, that's not what makes the difference. The brain makes the difference, but we didn't have brain scans to know that yet. What we did find was that pretty consistently, some women can do things better than some men. And some men can do things better than some women. But there's usually more difference in level of competence within a group of females and within a group of males than there are even between them. I was asked to make a presentation to NOW, National Organization of Women. I went and made the presentation. I was never invited back. I made it once. Because my whole emphasis was based on what we're learning. We are very different, and as a group of females and as a group of males, we'll each be able to do some things better, more efficiently than the other. And the representatives from NOW's premise was anything a man can do, I can do better. Okay, disabuse yourself of that. You might be able to do some things better than some men, but in general, we have different abilities. So that did not work with my understanding of the brain. Males, 40% of your body mass is muscle. You burn more calories when you're sleeping, 5 more calories an hour when you're sleeping than we do as females, because we don't have nearly that much muscle tissue, which immediately ought to remind you women that we can't eat as much as a male can if you want to maintain your weight within a healthy range, because we don't have as much muscle tissue and we don't burn fat when we sleep like a male does. And in the same way, there was at least one woman who's been on the Indianapolis 500. I forget her name. Did she ever win? Did she ever win? No, she didn't. I think it's amazing that she even made it to the circuit. She could do something that most other women could not do, but she still could not outperform the male brain because it's gifted at that kind of activity. So just accept it and start learning to have fun with it. Study conclusions, when you look at male-female brain differences, are usually presented as generalizations on the bell curve distribution, which some of you may actually remember from high school. And you may remember that the generalizations really apply to 2/3 of the population, which here is represented by these 2 red bars, meaning that 1/3 of the population fall outside of this generalization. So when you say that this applies to males primarily, or this applies to females primarily, it doesn't apply to 100%. It applies in general to 2/3 of the population. Some are even more closely aligned to that, and some are not as closely aligned. What it's important to understand is that doesn't invalidate the research. It just means that every brain on the planet is unique, and it doesn't always align with the research. And as I mentioned, sometimes there's more difference within a group of males or within a group of females in terms of skill levels and competence than there are if you're trying to compare the two. So here's a relatively new type of brain scan. It's called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. Fascinating type of testing modality. It measures the flow of water along the axon of a neuron. So those of you who remember biology, this is a drawing of a neuron, a thinking cell. You have this long axon, and that's how information leaves the cell, goes down here to the end. Neurotransmitters pick up the information, swim it across that gap, Hong Kong Harbor. It's picked up by the dendrites, the fingers on the neighboring neuron, and that's all thinking is. You're exchanging information from one neuron to another, to another, to another. DTI will show you, because it measures the flow of water along the axon, how parts of the brain are connected, if they're connected. These axons have to be wrapped with myelin, think fiber optics, and that takes a while to accomplish. We say, for example, that these axons, this bridge of long nerve fibers that connect the 2 hemispheres of the brain, they're not wrapped with insulation until at least age 20 or 21. And until that happens, the brain is at risk of shorting out, meaning information will try to go from the right hemisphere to the left across the corpus callosum, but it's not completely paved. It's not completely wrapped with insulation. It'll hit a pothole, and they can't remember what even they were saying. And once that gets done in both males and females, you tend to think a little more consistently. There are more of these myelinated axons in the right hemisphere and in the corpus callosum itself. People say, how come there's more white matter in the right hemisphere? Because I think it contains the 3 protective emotions: anger, fear, and sadness. And because fear, for example, is involved with signaling you about danger, something has to happen really quickly. And information travels across the axons in that right hemisphere probably faster than anywhere else in the brain, maybe up to 600 miles an hour. And we're talking what? 4 inches? You can imagine how fast that's lightning fast transmission of information. When you take a brain and you do a DTI on it, the results come out as what's called a connectome. It's a neural map that shows how the different parts of the brain are connected. When I made this slide, DTI had figured out at least 100 connective patterns from different parts of the brain. There's far more now. And because researchers are never content with doing just 1 or 2 studies, they always want to compare something. So they started looking at the connectome differences in the brains of males and females. And by the way, feel free to get up and walk around anytime you want to. The research is that 50% of brains learn best when they're standing and moving. If you've got that kind of brain, get up and stand and move anytime you want to. I told that to an audience over in Fiji, and somebody said, well, we wouldn't want to bother you. I said, I have eyes, but I'm not really visual. I won't even notice that you get up and stand. I am auditory. If you knock a pew over, I'll get that. But other than that, it won't bother me. So whatever your brain needs to do, do it. All right, let's look at a brain connectome from a male brain. You will notice that the patterns run pretty much up and down in each hemisphere. There's only one part of the brain where the connections between the hemispheres are greater than those in the female brain, and that's down here in the cerebellum. Cerebellum is linked to motor control. Male brains have way more connectors in the 2 cerebellum lobes. So that ought to explain the reason that no female has ever won the Indianapolis 500, because that's about motor control. And how when you watch the Olympics, especially in skiing, males and females both ski in the Olympics. But the criteria for downhill and slalom and jumping and everything else, the criteria is harder for the male because he can do more. Women can do a lot, but not at the level of males. I was watching the ice skating competitions on television not too long ago, because remember, I came from Canada. Got my first pair of skates when I was 9 months old. I did skate right away, but you have to give the kids skates. Well, these male skaters at the top of the list were doing quads and double triples and multiple axles and all kinds of things. And when the women came out, Some of them could do some of that, but no female ice skater at the top of the heap has ever outperformed a male in terms of the jumping and the twirling and so on. We don't have the muscle power. Remember what percentage of a male's body is typically in muscle? 40%. That's a lot. That's almost half their bodies. So if any male offers to help me carry anything, I take it and I'm grateful, because they have 3 times the upper body strength if they're my height, and twice the lower body strength. I was in Los Angeles not long ago, and coming out of a hotel, a woman was ahead of me, and a man saw her coming and opened the door and stepped back, and she said, "I can open my own door." I was so disappointed. I almost went up to her and said, "Are you trying to wreck it for the rest of us who understand it's 1/3 the energy for him to open the door than me?" And that's a self-esteem issue. You know, it's not about competition. It's about, you guys have more muscle than I do. Anytime you want to carry anything for me, anytime you want to carry me over a puddle, I'm so happy to have you do it, because it's a fraction of the energy for you. And women who don't understand that are losing the benefit they could get and making him feel like a clod. So whose problem is that? It's not his. Okay, so got this? Up and down means yes. All right. Now, what does this configuration mean? With all of these connectors going top to bottom in each hemisphere? Well, it may enable male brains to be more attuned to what's going on around them, so they can take action immediately if they have to. They tend to have the stronger connections compared to the female brain down here in the cerebellum for motor and spatial skills. They are more accurate marksmen. There's many things they can do at a higher level than the female brain can. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us, because we have our own strengths, but they're not equal. They do a better job at tasks that require clear hand-eye coordination, unless a female is talking to them. For example, in the left frontal lobe is the part of the brain where you use tools: hammers, screwdrivers, pliers, and electrical tools. Here's the problem. In that same part of the brain is Broca's area, where you speak aloud, and Wernicke's area, where you hear speech sounds and decode them. Now, a male can do 2 things simultaneously. A female can never do that. 2 things simultaneously, as long as each one comes out of a different hemisphere. So the male with his right hemisphere could be assembling a swing set in the backyard for his kids or grandkids or whatever, and never even reading the instructions, which kind of irritates me, because I read the instructions and I don't even understand them. And he can be holding a conversation with the left hemisphere about a totally different subject and doing it simultaneously. Women can't do that. We look like we're multitasking, but we can't do anything simultaneously except maybe breathe and talk. But here's what happens. He's using electrical equipment, frontal left. His wife comes out, well-meaning, or his girlfriend, or his daughter, totally unenlightened, and starts talking to him, which means now he has to activate Wernicke's area. And if she expects a response, he has to activate Broca's area. And very shortly, he's minus a digit or 2. And that's often how electrical accidents happen to men. because some woman came out and started talking to him. So if anybody you care about is using electrical equipment and they're a male, don't go near him. And if you do, shut up, because you will put him at risk for an accident. Just the way it is. They're better at understanding where objects are in space. Now, the other day I was watching baseball. It's kind of like watching baseball. It's amazing to me how there's a fly ball and the guy will run up, jump and crash into the wall and lean over and catch it. I've never seen a woman do that. And they'll just go, and there's the ball. I mean, they've got really good understanding of where objects are in space. All right, now here's looking up, looking down on the brain so that you can see now the two hemispheres, not just each side. And do you see how this goes? There's some red. That's the cerebellum. You see, there's one cerebellum, there's the other one. And they've got more connectors cross hemisphere there than female brains do. So this wiring style sets males up for exhibiting better spatial skills, better motor muscle control, better map reading and direction finding. Now, that's probably not so critical now that we have GPSs, but back in the late 1800s when I was a kid, almost any male, could figure something out looking at a map. I look at a map and I have to figure out how to orient it north. So I have to turn it around however I need to till it gets to north, and then I can pretty well get some sense of where we're going. They don't even need a map. My father was amazing. We'd go to a strange city. He might look at a map, the big map at the entrance of the town, and after that, he didn't need one. And my mother could not find her way out of the driveway. She took out the fence post twice. Now, there are some men who can't get out of a paper bag, and there are some women who do very well in terms of directions. But remember, those are outside the 2/3. Vehicle driving, men are better drivers, more skillful, period, hands down. So, how come they have 14% more accidents per miles driven? How does that function? Because they exhibit masculinity as they perceive it by taking chances when they're driving. And more of them drive when they're spifflicated. They have a bit of alcohol in the brain. But that doesn't mean they're not more skillful drivers. It's just they also exhibit behaviors that you'd think they'd be wise enough to avoid, but not always. And they're much better at translating perception to motor skills, as in some sports. If you've ever watched the Winter Olympics, and I watch very little television, but I love the Winter Olympics. When they do that big downhill thing, where they just ski off into air and flip around 37 times and land on their skis, you may have noticed that, and it's interesting to me, most announcers will suddenly start talking a little softer, as if the guy at the top of the hill with his helmet and everything on can hear him. And they'll say something like this: you'll notice that number 742 from Finland is at the top of the giant whatever. He is mentally picturing how he wants to go down this event. And as he pictures it, his cerebellums will translate that into motor actions, and he'll start down the hill, and his brain will take over, and he will be successful. That's amazing to me. The thing we've now learned is that anybody can do that, males or females. But in some sports, males are going to do it far better. All right, so you got the male brain. You picture in your mind what the connectomes look like. So let's look at the female connectome. The female connectomes are grouped around the frontal lobes. There are some, of course, that go down into the lower posterior parts, but you see any red in the cerebellum at all? Not a zip, none. There's probably some connectors, but nothing that registered on the DTI. And their connections tend to run horizontally, not vertically. Most of the male connections are vertical, remember, except when you get to the cerebellum, and then there's lots of cross-hemispheric connections. Well, female brain is not like that. Lots of cross-hemispheric connections and some longitudinal ones. So, what does that do for the female brain in terms of advantage? Well, it gives them an advantage in pulling information together from different sources and drawing a global conclusion. Because the male tends to be in one side of the hemisphere, and he doesn't want to move to the other side until he's done everything he needs to do in this side. And then he's willing to move into the other side. Female brain is not like that. It's back and forth all the time. My son, who's a CHP, says, "Mom, women spend a lot more time on the highway. Isn't that what you're telling me?" And basically, yes, a lot more time on the corpus callosum. The left hemisphere handles logical thinking, while the right is associated with intuition. This configuration is believed to give women what researchers are calling a sixth sense of intuitive knowing. Now, intuition is right frontal lobe. Males and females can have good intuition. But one of the benefits of the wiring of the female is that we have a little extra sense of intuitive knowing. The problem is we have trouble articulating it. So I will sometimes, my family learned, I'll sometimes get a really strong feeling that this is what we should do, or this is not what we should do. And, the family would say, "Well, why?" I can't tell you why. My brain has not given me a reason. It's just given me a really strong feeling. And if we went with it without exception, it was the right thing to do. But if I was insecure and said, "Well, you probably know better, all right, let's do it," we always had some kind of a problem. There's more gray matter in the hippocampus, which is right in the middle of the brain, actually right close to the divides, and probably two separate ones, one in each hemisphere. That's the brain search engine, just like a search engine on the internet, on your computer. It controls communication skills. And research says that on average, females use many more times a day of words. The male maybe uses 10 or 12,000 words a day, usually at work. Dr. Dobson used to say that by the time the average male got home from work, he had left a couple of shrugs, a couple of yeses, and a couple of nos. And that's about it. He's used his words up at work. Women go 12 to 15,000 words a day if she doesn't lecture. And the problem can be that if she's fortunate enough to be able to stay home when the children are really small and doesn't have a lot of adult conversation, she's ready to talk when he gets home. And he's only got a couple of yeses and a couple of nos. And, she can exhaust him. So I tell women, you got to have some good girlfriends, that you can call up and you can tell your girlfriend your stories. Because he doesn't want the stories. He only wants a bottom line if he wants it at all. Does not want the story. Men speak in bottom lines. Women never almost speak in bottom lines. They start at A and tell the story all the way to Z, and then they go back and repeat some of it. And he's tuned out after the first 7 words. So you need to learn to talk in bottom lines, especially if he just got home from work, and not take it personally. They are also have more wiring connections in regions linked to memory and social cognition, which is involved with understanding how people are feeling and reading body language. Again, Dr. Dobson used to use some interesting, focus on the family, use some interesting allegories. He says he and his wife went to a Christmas party one time with all of the people working for him. And as they were going home, his wife said, "Boy, he's getting ready to leave his wife, isn't he?" And Dr. Dobson said, "What?" He says, "I think so-and-so is getting ready to leave his wife." He says, "That's crazy. Where did you get that idea from?" "Well, I was just watching his body language, and I think he's going to leave her." That's just nuts. 7 months later, he left his wife. Dobson came home and said, "What did you see that I didn't see?" Well, there's more connections related to social cognition and memory, and women sometimes pick up things that men don't. And so that's why a male-female team can be really helpful. All right, so here now is looking at the female brain from the top down. How different does that look? So can you see all of the connections between the 2 hemispheres? And not a whole lot going down here. There's a few connections in the cerebellum, meaning that we know how to get dressed with our underwear first, and we know how to open and close doors, but it's not the same as in the male brain. So what does this help a female brain do? Better verbal skills, better intuitive abilities. When females and males are giving memory test results about recalling words and remembering faces, women usually come out way ahead. And social cognition test results attempting to measure EQ skills and empathy. That doesn't mean men cannot develop EQ and have empathy. It means when you're trying to test for that, women seem to come out way ahead on the test, which may be the test in combination with brain function. Now, that is entirely different than the male brain wiring. So here they are side by side. Male brain, lots of connections going up and down in each hemisphere, some in the cerebellum, more than in the female brain, but look at this. That's a huge difference, and it's not going to change. Now, the interesting thing is, if you do a connectome study on a 7 or 8-year-old, there's a combination of these two. Looks very different. But apparently, during gestation, the brain is set up to rewire itself at puberty. Puberty is a hard time for young people often. Just imagine living at home and having your entire house rewired while you're living in it. That's pretty much what's happening during puberty. So it's no wonder that it's a little stressful. And after puberty, you do connectome studies, and the male brain looks like this, and the female brain looks like this. Independently, they each have strengths. Together, if they're healthy and functional, they can be almost invincible because they bring different skills to the table. Now, in the female brain, if any part of the brain is on, it's all on, because there's no separation between the 2 hemispheres. Think of it as a trunk. There's lots more connectors. Think of it as opening the trunk, and here's a bunch of stuff in it. And you start digging through it, looking for different things. or for one thing, but you keep bumping into other things as you're looking for that one thing. And so a woman can start looking for something and go, oh, I haven't thought of that for years. And now she stops and thinks about that, forgets even what she was looking for. And then after she's talked about that, she'll go, okay, what was I looking for? Oh, yeah. She'll start looking again. It's not like the male brain. The downside of that is that, let's say a couple had an argument leaving the house for work one morning, and he makes the mistake of calling her a horse face or something like that. She dumps it in her trunk. And every time she gets into that trunk all day, guess what? She runs into horse face. And by the time she gets home at night, it has grown like Topsy's yeast to the point she can't even get the lid shut on her trunk. And when he walks through the door, it's painful. Well, the male brain, think of the male brain as two independent, pretty much, banks of drawers and pigeonholes and cupboards. So he's usually in one side or the other, depending on what he's doing. He might be in the right hemisphere, he might be in the left hemisphere. And whichever one he isn't in is idling. It's like your car idling at the red light. That means that the lights are off, air conditioning is off, computer's off. It's just sitting there waiting. It takes him less energy to run his brain, women, because he's only using half of it at a time. And that's good for him. If any part of ours are on, the whole thing is running, whether or not we need that part. So it takes us much more energy to run our brains. So let's say that he's in one side of his brain, doesn't matter what, calls his wife a horse face and gets in the car to drive to work. He takes that incident and puts it in a drawer and shuts it. Now he opens his work drawer, wherever it is. Now he's focused on work. And believe me, he has thought not one time about the altercation that morning. Now work is over. He's still in his work drawer. He has not stopped to think about, now let me see, I'm going home. What was the last thing that happened this morning? I wonder if there's anything I need to think about. He doesn't think about that. He walks in and says, hi, hon, how was your day? And she tells him. And it's not pretty because he never went back in to the morning home drawer to find out what was the last thing that happened there. And that's the basis for a lot of conflict. Joy tends to be, when you do PET scans, aligned with the left hemisphere, which is where language is loaded, remember? Audible language, heard and read language. So females are pretty comfortable talking out their emotions, especially because although the three protective emotions, anger, fear, and sadness, are in the right hemisphere, they can access anything really quickly. Look at all those bridges. So something can happen that triggers anger, they can talk about it immediately. The male brain tends to act out those protective emotions rather than talk them out, especially if they happen to be in the right hemisphere. And researchers show that it can take 2 or 3 days for a male to process the same incident as a female in his family before he can say anything about it. And when he does say something about it, it'll probably just be the bottom line. So women, it's really unhelpful when something happens and you throw out what you want to do and your male family members haven't said a word and you say, talk to me. Are you part of this? Why aren't you saying anything? Well, if you push him to say something, what he says will not be his considered opinion because it's going to take him 2 or 3 days to really decide that. So you're just going to exacerbate the problem. So men, If any female ever says to you, talk to me, tell me what you think, here's your response. I'm processing. When I come to a conclusion, you'll be the first to know. And you shut up and go talk to your girlfriends about it. We've talked about skillful drivers and less skillful drivers. Now, here's something, men. Women see better at night than you do. You see better in the daytime than they do. So if you're on a long trip and you both need to drive, let her sleep in the day while you're driving and let her drive at night, because they have way fewer accidents per mile driven. So back to the guy who said, if I understand this, will it make the differences go away? No, because the way the brain's wired, and we had no idea. But you can make your life easier and more difficult if you expect the opposite gender to think like you do, because now we know that the brain wiring is diametrically different. But if you understand this, it really can be fun. I refuse to argue. It's just one brain thinking it really knows. And if you talk louder and longer, some other dumb brain will finally get it. So I can't tell you the last time I had an argument. But this is the cause of a lot of arguments. So if you start understanding the difference, forget the arguing. You know, when he comes to it, he'll come to it. And hopefully, if you have open communication lines, he'll say, you know, I was thinking about that the last couple of days. Good. And this is what I've come to the conclusion. And it's often going to be the same conclusion you came to, only he'll arrive at it in a different way. And the last thing we'll talk about in this section is that the female brain has no printout. It's like a calculating computer, but there's no printout. The male brain always has a printout. That means when a male is thinking about something, if he wants to, he is able to tell you the steps his brain went through to arrive at the conclusion. It may not be the right conclusion because he may have the wrong data, but he can tell you how he got there. Female brain can't tell you how they got there. It's just an impression. It's literally like him being able to print out, this is what I thought. No printout on the female brain. So I finally got this across to my husband and 3 teenage sons. So we went to Disneyland. And I was at the entrance and I said, you know what? I feel like we ought to just walk straight over to the other side of the park and start there. Because most people are going to stop right. But I want to go on the Matterhorn. You'll get to the Matterhorn, but I think we need to go across. There's going to be nobody at the other side. Well, how do you know that? Well, I just think that's how it's going to work. And my middle son held up his hand and he says, guys, no printout. Stop asking her. Start walking. And that has become a very inside family joke. Okay, you got the difference? Staggering, isn't it? I mean, it's staggering, but it's fun. All right, I want you to get up. I want you to move around, walk, breathe. Those of you who were afraid to stand up because you thought I'd notice. And then we'll talk about the new research on how males and females handle stress. You're saying that you must force yourself to use the left hemisphere because that's what they've been taught to use.
Yeah, like always to pull and talk
I know.
doing that.
And we have to often adapt in order to even be part of the conversation.
Exactly. And also be always present with our words instead of giving them attention. And sometimes like this like a divergent thinking, but actually men are not like a divergent.
They usually think much more short term, and they're actually better at problem solving short term. They tend to not think down the line like women do. And that's why it's the best of both worlds if everybody's healthy enough to collaborate.
But I a lot of times I feel like because I need to adapt their content and I'm suppressing my female brain and I need to
You're not suppressing your female brain, you're just using another part of it. Fortunately, you can.
Mhm.
And in environments where your right brain is accepted and valid, you use it there.
yeah. But
You're not going to get them to change. Look how their brains are wired. You're not going to get them to change.
but sometimes like when my female brain comes out, I always feel like rejected.
If you speak female, they will reject it.
Yeah.
But what you do is you take your right brain intuition, figure out how to say it in a left brain function, and they'll be much more likely to accept it. You never use the word feel, never. I think, because they never talk about how they feel. I think, and then you learn to give them the bottom line. If they want to ask questions, they actually will. But you don't give them what you would give a female.
But the thing is that like even though like you use your like I think the left hand side brain to think, like which is you think more like as a
You're thinking more step by step instead of holistically. That's the difference.
yes, to think like a man. You always do that.
No, you're thinking like a left hemisphere person because there are women whose advantage is in the left hemisphere and there are men whose advantage is in the right hemisphere. So you're not thinking about male or female. You're thinking left hemisphere or right hemisphere.
But can I like so your advice is I could think with both my brains, like both hemispheres, my brain.
But you
communicate.
articulate it in a left brain style if there's mostly men there.
Left brain style, which means I always put down from
Just the bottom line, and here's the steps. And when you learn to do that, women are very successful.
and make it extremely logical and concise instead of
Exactly.
saying like, oh, this is my intuition, this is my.
Never use the word intuition, never use the word I feel. If you're in a group, female group, yeah.
But do you feel like this is not very like to women's advantage because we always need to kind of, for me, it's like depressing and
That's a choice.
And,
Because almost
okay.
half,
yeah.
probably 40% of men think with more with their right brain, and about 40% of women think more with the left. So it's not that there aren't right and left brain thinkers.
I agree. Like, there's no way I don't use my right hand side if I don't use my right hand side.
So if you want to think that this is unfortunate for women, you can think that. Unfortunately, that's how most countries run. So you either learn how to work within the system or you go work for an all-female group. It's the real world. But it gets to be fun. Figuring it out and being able to state it. If in 5 years we want to have this product be really successful, I think what we need to do is 1, 2, 3, and then you shut up. And sometimes they'll just look at it and roll their eyes, but often they'll come back at a later meeting and they'll say, you know, guys, this is what we need to do. And you'll go to yourself, that's what I said last month. Fine, let them think it's their own idea. You got what you wanted.
I see. And sometimes I feel like my brain is like because because I use my right hand side and also my right hand side like simultaneously. But sometimes
Yeah, because here's the highway.
Divergent thinker and my job has extremely high requirements for me to think extremely logical methodology.
Change your wording. You're not thinking like a man. Your job requires left hemisphere thinking.
Yeah, left hemisphere thinking. And how can I instill those kind of two parts of the brain? Because it's just very tiring. Like
Well, anytime, I don't know what your brain lead is, where you have your energy advantage. But when you're outside of that, that takes more energy. But you either learn to do it or you find a job where you don't have to do it. Well, that's what most of us have had to do. And we can do it. And then when you get out of that environment, now I can use my right brain all weekend.
How do you make it easier for your brain both to feel like a nice fit together, even though it's
They're working together like hand in glove. They're not separate in the female brain. They're all mixed up together. Just by telling yourself that this is what is required at work and I'm able to do this. I've got the kind of brain that can do this. And right now I'm using more left brain function. When I get off work, I'll use more right brain function to balance it out.
which means that I need to bring
After work, you do. And I don't know whether that's music or whatever your right brain is.
what kind of things does the right brain usually want to do?
All kinds of creative, connective, relational things. Go to my website. I've got entire sections on what each part of the brain does.
Why are you drinking your water? So here's the thing. In Sabbath school, maybe 2 weeks ago, we were talking about, I think it's Act 6, where the church had grown, and so the women were saying they were left behind. So they brought it up. So we had a discussion about it, not from 2,000 years ago, but the nowadays perspective. Okay, so things are going on. So my contention, I was leading the discussion, is that okay, you have a problem, so how are we going to fix it? So when I hear something like that, which I hear all the time, so my thing is we should really look about fixing it. That's why
There's nothing to fix, and it's only a problem if you think it's a problem. It's
so
just different
somebody
ways of
said,
looking.
so I had to think about it. Somebody said, oh, so that's a guy thing.
Because
This is
the
another
male
guy.
brain,
Wait. This is another guy who said it. It's a guy
male
thing.
brain wants to fix everything, and some things don't need fixing. They just need to be accepted.
So this person said sometimes, this is a lady who said you may want to, she didn't say you want to talk about it. What was the expression she used? Which to me is a little bit surprising, because if you come and you complain about something, I think it's a complaint about something you're not happy
But
with.
that's your perception. It may just be a suggestion for a different way to do things. It may not be a problem. If everything that comes out of a woman's mouth is a problem for you, you've got problems.
Ooh.
Tell them.
You do, because everything is not a problem. It may just be a different perspective. But male brains want to fix everything. So when I'm talking to a male,
I'm thinking of the solution.
I will say,
Immediately.
Rob, I want to talk to you about something that happened the other day. I think I have the solution. So right now, I only want you to listen to me. And when I'm done, if you have a suggestion, I'm really open to it. But what happens is a woman gets 3 sentences out, and he says, let me tell you how to fix that. Okay, she's not gotten it out in front of her so she can even see it.
Right. There's no printout.
There's no printout.
No
but
printout.
But by talking aloud, she gets it out in front of her. And when a male stops that process, she never gets it out in front of her.
There's no picture.
Then
You
it
didn't get to finish
becomes
the
a
picture.
problem.
Yeah.
And it's the male who's caused it because he didn't give her time to get it out in
To
front of
paint the
her.
picture.
And if you think it's a problem, that's how you approach it.
Interesting. So
it's
no,
fascinating.
I do know, however, that sometimes, because I have it with my clients, the act of speaking it out, you actually speak out the solution for yourself.
Exactly.
Verbal.
For a
Yes.
woman,
Yes.
because she doesn't know what she thinks till she hears what she says.
Yeah. And so I've had that. People call up and I say, okay, I'll ask some questions to lead them through, and they talk, and then oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
But you actually help them because you allowed them to get it
Space.
out in front of them. And yes, they came
So
to
now
their
that
own
is really
solution.
challenging, because when you start say, okay, blah 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 blah, and so after 3 minutes, I figured out where you're going. I don't know what the thing is, so now you're wasting my time. That's how I would. I
No,
look
you're
at it.
not. Well, that's your problem then, because if you're talking to a male,
Yeah.
he'll be ready much more quickly
Yeah.
for a solution.
Mhm.
But if you think she's wasting your time,
Mhm.
you then have prevented her from helping being part of the solution.
Mhm.
And that's hard for men. They don't get it.
Okay,
We ready?
we're ready.
All
Let's do
right.
it.
So about a month or two ago, I went through a 2-week period of apathy, like hardcore apathy. And I was very interested with this depression discussion. What are some things? Is that a ton of depression or like?
Well, apathy is a sign of overwhelm.
Okay.
And you don't exactly haven't figured out what to do about this overwhelm.
Okay, that would explain it because it was in relation to like basically hating my job. 'Cause I kind of hated that.
Neither have I.
Okay, then
I was
you
just
either
curious.
need to learn to like it or you need to find another.
I
And
always,
you can learn
always.
to like it in
She hasn't
a different
been
way
here,
if you
but
want,
she's been talking
because it
since
all
with the amen.
But depression is not necessarily.
Okay, because it's curious because I do have a history with my family and stuff. So
Well, then you would want to watch that, because if your apathy went on and on and on, then
so what are some good ways to be careful of apathy and not let it get too crazy?
well, the antidote is gratefulness, thankfulness,
Humor.
humor.
That's why you resonate so much with comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Because
He does improv.
I
He does
did
improv.
oh, there you go.
There you- That's a
Well,
good
how
thing.
come?
The people who
We
did
all
those
need
things, it was just for fun. There's no way to grow. There's no feedback. No,
But it's good therapy for you, though.
Well, it's good therapy, or you find a group that wants to grow.
Yeah, well, right now I'm doing design, so that's kind of.
What is this?
I'm making all this up. Oh, did you see
If you went to all 4 sections, you get 4 hours. Okay. So just write 4 in. Yep. Yep. And we need to give this to you? You do?
So for the audiobook?
And hopefully your email is legible, because I only do it by email.
So it's
Let me make sure.
the 5mm adapters.
Don't worry
So
about it,
it's a
you
folder
can
that
write it
fits
in when I
on
send you
the
this.
rack in there.
Okay.
And I just
But
slide
I
it in.
only do it by email, so you gotta make sure I can read it. Can you read that?
No, so I could, and then I'm
I
getting
don't
some other
know.
stuff
I'll have to give you something.
Dude, you need some, yeah?
I always got stuff I'm thinking of.
Dorothy
I could always use projects.
Newby at
Where's my pen?
SBCglobal. I got it. Okay, wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, we're ready. Hold on.
How about this one?
So hard.
PIWAIR 1977
This one is not
At the
that.
homeless field.
Okay.
Yes.
at yahoo.com. Okay, then give me this pen, because
We'd like to
this
see you
is
there,
not.
too.
No more.
Okay.
That's my New
Okay,
Year's
and that is
resolution.
a, okay, I got it.
I put it on my calendar.
It's one of the best resolutions you would make.
Yes, it is.
Jerry K.O.
AJ.
2004
200.
2004. Okay, I think I got it.
Thank you.
All right, let's go.
Let us go one more and we're done. And you're going to Bethesda after this. Holy moly. When do you go home?
After No, I have to go back and record on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday with a group from Australia. Okay. What's the rule when I'm speaking? Yes, get up, move around. Okay, so you got that first part nailed, right? Well, at least Pastor Rob does. That's a blessing for all of you. All right, stress. Huge body of research just coming out about stress. Here's the first thing to take home. There is no stress until an individual brain decides there is. There's just the ordinary stress of living, stress is living, but there's negative stress. There's no negative stress to an organism unless you decide there's negative stress. For example, a couple came to see me. She walked in, smoke coming out of her ears. He walked in, hands in his pockets, and went over and looked out the window. First thing you need to stop doing, women, is ever tell a boy or a man to look at you. Very stressful to be told to look at somebody. If they know you, they know what you look like. They don't need to look at you. But so many parents and teachers will say, look at me when I'm talking to you. And that just will downshift anybody, sometimes for several days. So I don't mind if he's looking out the window. I'm talking, he's listening. So I said to his wife, what can I do for you? Well, she said, my husband, the guy looking out the window, so you know that she's used to saying, look at me when I'm talking to you, wants to move his mother in with us. And I'm telling you, if he does that, I'm out of here. She will ruin our lives. So I say to the guy looking out the window, I take it she's talking about your mother? He nods. I said, what can you tell me about your mother? He turns around, glances at me, looks out the window again, and he says, well, she's difficult, I'll give you that. I left home when I was 15, never went back again. I said, so could you tell me the reason that you want to move her in with you? Well, it's cheaper. I go, well, it may not be cheaper in emotional exhaustion. Well, he says, how long can she live? I said, probably longer than you think. So we had an interesting time trying to resolve that. Different reactions to stressors. So let's do another set of brain benders. You've done them once. Those of you who may have done more than once, let's see how you do. All right, this is a word in a word. Think how it sounds, not necessarily how it's spelled. One word starts here and goes this way, and one starts here and goes backwards. You could do this. The first word is what? Wool. Dyed in the wool. There you go. Second on the left. Think weather. Slightly overcast. Third on the left. It's another word in a word. Shot in the dark. Fourth on the left. The word is I often write things backwards. Split decision. The brain doesn't care if it's forward or backwards. You could read an entire book through with every word backwards as long as it was in the right order. But it's just more stimulation from your brain. Top right. Word in a word. Tree is one of the words. Good. Tree in the street. Second on the right. Name of a song. Yes, Never on Sunday. Third on the right. Hurry up. Fourth on the right. Heads up. Now, did you hear how quickly you did that whole set? Probably in 1/10 of the time as you did the first set. All your brain has to do is do it once and it's ready for you to do it again. It's amazing. That's why when you're studying, for me, I do better when I'm studying to be walking around and reading because I learn better when I'm moving. So I'll do a section and then I'll take a 10-minute break and then I'll go over the high points of that section. My brain's already got something laid down. It reinforces it. It's just amazing how much easier it is to learn. All right. It takes stress just to live because stress means that your brain and body is able to do something different when you ask it to do something different. Just saying I'm going to sit down or I'm going to get up is asking your brain and body to do something different. But, so sometimes people say to me, well, if I could just get rid of the stress in my life, and I'd say, well, you could, but then you'd be dead. But it's the negative stress that you want to deal with. So 3 main categories of stress. Eustress, it's positive, it helps you grow. I'm under eustress. I have chosen to accept the invitation to be here. And when you choose to do something, even if it's difficult, there's really no negative stress. And every time I make a presentation, I learn it better. So it helps you grow. Distress is absolutely negative. You want to avoid it whenever possible. Can't avoid everything. The fire in, I'm really thinking about the fire in paradise this weekend. If you can avoid it, do so. And if, in fact, 50% of the problems we have in life are of our own making, and you figure out how you're contributing to your own problems, well, you're just going to dump 50% of the turnip problems off the back of your truck. And that's going to relieve a lot of the negative stress. Now, mistress, and please notice how that is spelled. First time I talked about mistress, somebody in the audience said, I know all about that. My husband's had 3 of them. And I said, no, I think that would be outright distress. But mistress is hidden stress. You sit too long at the computer without getting up and walking around. Your life is not in balance. You let yourself get exhausted, and then doing anything healthful is very, very difficult. You have to commute long hours, and you fail to put something in the car to listen to that will either help you learn or that you will enjoy. I mean, you got to think ahead for mistress. And both distress and mistress, if you don't manage them, they literally can kill brain cells. And that can lead you down the line to illness and dementia eventually. Every brain is unique. I keep saying that, and I hope you're getting it, because I will go back to places that I've spoken about, and somebody will come up to me and say, I heard you speak last time, but it just seems hard to believe that every brain on the planet is unique. And I'll say, well, what do you know about fingerprints? We've never found 2 identical fingerprints anywhere on the planet. So how is it that it's so hard for you to realize that every brain is different? It's as different as your fingerprints. And one person says to me, well, you're white, so you probably don't understand. And I go, understand what? Well, I don't know. You just probably don't understand. And I said, what I do understand is I don't care about skin color, because our brains are the same color, identical. You can crack a skull open and take the brain out, and you cannot tell what color their skin was. Our hearts are the same color. Come on. That's all artificial. So every brain is unique, which beside male-female differences means that we have a lot of differences to process through. Stress reactions are typically learned in childhood. They are often related to perception and flexibility. So if you think because I'm white, I can't understand anything about Asians or Blacks or Native Americans, think again. In a way, people are people. The brain has the same functions. And it's your problem if you assign a quantity to that that's going to make it difficult for you to work with people who are different from you, because everybody is. The stress reactions are often triggered by anger, fear, or sadness, a sense of being different, a feeling of being rejected or unaccepted or marginalized or disenfranchised, and so on. I mentioned this morning that in general, it's pretty hard for a preacher's kid growing up in today's environment. And of the 2, males or females, I think it's probably hardest on females. because even church members will cut boys a little slack. They're just sowing their wild oats, but girls are never supposed to sow wild oats. So I don't know what you learned growing up, but you learned something. And what you learned is either serving you well in adulthood or not. So the question becomes, how healthy are your responses? And you can relearn them, or you can learn entire new ones. This piece about flexibility is really important. Trees that can't flex in the wind are at high risk for being uprooted. Well, the same thing with people. If you can't flex, if it has to be your way or the highway, you're destined to have a pretty stressful life. And anybody who relates to you is probably going to have higher levels of negative stress. However, having said that, males and females find some stressors more problematic than others. And in large sample studies, here are the stress issues that seem to be more difficult for men. Work issues. Don't like where they work. Don't like who they work with. All right, you have two choices. Learn to like at least 51% of it, or find another job. But you can't afford to live with that kind of stress. Unemployment is difficult because males tend to identify their worth with whether or not they're employed and how much money they make, which is a pretty artificial way of defining yourself. If they get fired, that's agonizing. Much harder for a male than a female. Women don't like to get fired either, but they're more likely to say, well, that didn't work out. Okay, we're going to find something that's a better fit. I've met men who were on the couch 11 years later after being fired, who didn't have the courage to go out and try to get employed again. So that's a choice sometimes people have to look at. Separation, if somebody they love dies, that's a pretty permanent separation. Or couple separates, and divorce emotionally is much more difficult for a male than a female. Now, divorce for a female is more difficult financially in general, but divorce for a male is horrible financially. Large sample studies in America show that the average female has about 9 people that at any time she thinks she could call and talk to them when she's got a big problem, and they listen to her and help her. Same questionnaire goes out to the males, and many of them put 0. And the rest of them, on average, put 1. And when asked who that 1 was, who do you suppose it was? Significant other. Girlfriend, boyfriend, husband. So if you're a male and you have 1 support person and you're married to that person and they bail on you, you have 0. So it can be really difficult for a male to go through divorce. Females, conflict. Female brain does not like conflict. And depending on where in the brain the person has their energy advantage, it can be even worse for them than for some other people. They don't like conflict. And they are often socialized to give themselves up, in essence, to keep the peace and not be the person they were intended to be. Serious illness, separation, and death within their proximal social network. So if their spouse dies, or their parents, or their siblings, or a child, it's actually more difficult for the female than for the male, because he can compartmentalize. He can put that death in a drawer and slam it shut and go to work and never think about it all day, and then start thinking about it again at night. But she's put it in her trunk and she's thinking about it all day long, and it can be pretty difficult. Now, all brains need effective stress management strategies, and I'm not going to give you the typical stress seminar with do this, do this, do this, do this. I'm going to tell you what studies have shown on how differently the male brain and the female brain respond to stressors, because that's key. Male brains appear to struggle far less with stress in the present moment. So the couple that came to see me, he goes, so how long can she live? I'm sure I can survive till she dies. I asked him how old she was. He said 68. I said, a lot of women are living to be 100 these days. Then he looked at me and he said, do you think she's going to live that long? I said, I don't know your mother, but I wouldn't plan on her kicking the bucket anytime soon. It wasn't such a big deal for him. His wife is just steaming. This is the worst thing that's going to happen. And if he actually moves her in, I'm moving out. So 2 different responses to the same event. But males are more likely to have a stress-related depressive disorder later in life than are women, because they've underestimated the stress in the moment. It builds up, and then it can really hit them midlife. Female brains tend to struggle more with the stress right now. This is horrible. And when they say that, often there's a well-meaning male who will look at them and say, well, it doesn't seem that bad to me. I mean, just get over it. Okay, that's all well and good, but that is not how the female brain operates. She's not going to just get over it unless you are wise enough as a male to say, tell me the worst thing you think that could happen about this event. And then you shut up and listen. And she says, well, I'm afraid of blah, blah, blah. And then he says, I see that a little different. I can understand now what's really upsetting you. What if we spent some time problem solving in a way that could decrease the stress for you and blah, blah, blah. But men don't know how to do that. If they know how to do it, they're good at it because they have fix-it brains. But the fix-it brain problem solving is only amenable to the female brain if she's been able to talk about what it is that's bothering her. So for many male brains, because literally they do have fix-it brains, she'll start talking. And 2 minutes and 43 seconds later, he'll stop her and say, oh, let me tell you how to fix that. She hasn't had time to get it out. And a woman does not know what she's thinking till she hears herself saying it. So you got to listen. And then she may be open to your suggestions to fix it. I was telling Pastor Rob that when I have a problem and I want to discuss it with a male, I tell him up front what I need. Sometimes I'll say, I just want to tell you about something that happened yesterday. My goodness, I solved it, but it was something else. I'd just like you to listen to me for 3 or 4 minutes so I can tell you about it. Now he knows there's nothing to fix. You can turn off the fix-it button. Or because otherwise he's pumped a lot of adrenaline getting ready to tell you how to fix it. Or I'll say, something happened at the office this week. I think I know what I should do, but I'd like to tell you about it. And when I'm done, if you'll be gracious enough just to listen, then I'm open to you telling me if you have a different idea. Okay, now he knows that he's going to have a chance to tell me how he thinks he should fix it, but I will have had a chance to get it out in front of me. And it's just all a matter of understanding and conversation. Now, female brains find it more stressful in the moment, and they are twice as vulnerable to stress-related disorders such as PTSD and depression. Doesn't mean the depression rates are twice that of a male, they're just twice as vulnerable. And that's a difference. The brain is the part of the system that recognizes a stressor first. It literally reacts in a split second to turn on the stress response as soon as it perceives that you think this is a really bad stressor. That stress response will pump adrenaline, cortisol, other hormones and neurotransmitters and enzymes for 72 hours after one stressful event. I've met people that I think have been triggering their stress response continually for years. Because let's say that I'm on Highway 5 driving to Sunnyvale and I have a flat tire. Okay, Highway 5, there's really not a lot of resources. So I pull off and I have only an hour to get where I should be in 20 minutes. I always leave extra. Call on my cell phone. I need help, flat tire. Policeman comes along. He actually gets out and changes the tire for me himself. Fabulous. I offered to tip him and he said, "Sorry, ma'am, can't take it. I'd like to." So I get to where I'm going on time. When I get there, I do a Broadway winning performance of telling everyone about this. My tire blew. I thought I was going to be late. And I do all the drama. I re-trigger the stress response. Now it's another 72 hours. And the more I find somebody who will listen to me and let me rehearse, the more I trigger the stress response. Ridiculous. Say it once, get it out in front of you, learn from it if there's something to learn, and get over it, or you will continually be triggering the stress response, which will result in suppressed immune system and an increased risk for illness and disease. I mentioned this is often what women hear from the males in their family when they say, "Oh, this is awful. I don't know if I can live through this." And he'll say, "I don't think it's any big deal. Just get over it." Well, not so easy for the female brain. Or a male will act stressed about something, and his significant other will say, "Pull yourself together, for heaven's sake. You're a man, aren't you? I mean, come on, get on with life." That's equally unhelpful because we have different responses. So, research. Male-female differences exist that are worth paying attention to, not only for the present moment, but also for 25 years later, especially for the male brain. So what are those? To figure that out, we go back to what we talked about first thing this morning. It was this morning, wasn't it? About the corticotropin releasing factor. When the brain recognizes a stressor, it will recognize it up here in the conscious thought part of the brain. And in the mammalian layer of the brain, the hypothalamus will trigger the release of this really powerful substance called CRF, both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. It goes down to the alarm system here in the reptilian layer. And if you think about the reptilian layer as a frog, that's about what it's like. You know, the frog is sitting placidly on the log, and a bird flies over, and he gets startled, and plop, he's in the water. It's reaction, you know, event, reaction. And once it hits the alarm center, then other messengers carry it to every cell in the brain and body. Norepinephrine, another hormone and neurotransmitter, is responsible for spreading the word throughout the brain and body. This news flash creates what's called a heightened emotional arousal in the brain. That's really helpful in the moment. So let's say that the back doors crashed open and somebody runs in military attire with a repeating rifle. Okay, That's going to trigger stress in me. But I've already thought about what I would do if that happened. I would probably be off the platform and under the first pew and hoping some male had his cell phone and had already called 911 or was big enough and strong enough to pick up a pew and launch it at the intruder or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So the immediate hyper brain arousal in actual danger is very, very useful. But most of the stuff we deal with in life is not actual danger. It's just perception, expectations. And we can keep triggering this and run away. Corticotropin releasing factor is a core feature of depression. So this morning we talked about how important it is to manage worry and anxiety because it tends to lead to depression. Well, it's equally important to avoid hyperarousal of the stress response system unless it's actual danger because it pours out CRF, and that is a core feature of depression. Do you see how things link together? And it's really helpful for me to understand that. So we talked about this morning. Who was not here this morning at 9:30? Okay, I'll go through this really quickly. This is one of the most powerful substances that the hypothalamus ever puts out. It's both a hormone like insulin, testosterone, progestin, estrogen, all of those. It will affect every cell in the body that's not a neuron. The neurotransmitter is going to affect every neuron in the nervous system. So you pour out CRF and every cell in your brain and body is going to be impacted, which is trillions of them. It can suppress appetite. You know, when the stress response turns on, the body says, well, what we don't need to do right now is eat. We got to save our lives. So it suppresses appetite. It's now being linked with anorexia nervosa. And people are beginning to realize that, recognized or not, that brain is exhibiting high levels of CRF. So it's really stressed for some reason. And that's maybe the underlying cause of that. It increases the person's subjective anxiety, meaning things start seeming worse and worse and worse. And that is linked with depression. It's linked with the euphoric feelings that accompany alcoholism. It's one of the reasons it's so difficult for some people to break the cycle of drinking alcohol, because alcohol is a huge toxin to the brain. The minute the brain realizes that you've taken even a sip of alcohol, it recognizes that as a toxin. It pours out CRF, and one of the things CRF does is momentarily make you feel better. And it's that flash of euphoria, especially in somebody's life that's not working very well, that keeps them going back and back and back to alcohol. But the euphoria just lasts a few seconds, and then you start getting all the other problems. It triggers inflammation, and that process, we think now, is linked with both multiple sclerosis and arthritis. And especially in multiple sclerosis, there's some research that shows about 24 months before a person develops symptoms that end up in a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, there has been a pretty impactful negative event in their lives. And high levels of this powerful substance has been found in the cerebral spinal fluid of people with major depression and those who have suicidal thoughts or who successfully commit suicide. All right, so rats. Rats make really good research subjects, especially when you really couldn't do the research on human beings. And they do make good research, animals, because their brains are very like human brains. So if somebody calls you a rat, that's not a negative. I mean, come on, our brains are very similar. Under a microscope, it's almost impossible to look at a human neuron and a rat neuron and know which is which. The human and the rat peptides, those neurological substances that have to do with mood, are almost identical. And rats can be trained to do cognitive tasks and neural activities linked with those specific tasks. They can learn to run a maze. They can carefully distinguish among different scents, different odors, far better than our brains can. So, to make good research subjects. So, researchers decided they wanted to look at male and female brains, and they chose rats to see how they handle stress. On average, this is how they do it. They get big vats of water, big barrels, and they fill it about half full of water, and they dump these rats into the water. Now, on average, these rats, males as well as females, could swim for up to 48 hours solid until their little noses started getting close to going under, and then they'd fish them out. That's a long time. But their brains responded very differently to the stress of swimming for 48 hours. In the stressed female rat, the brain acted macho. What does that mean? Here is a female rat neuron, a thinking cell. Do you see these receptor molecules all around the edge? I don't care how you put that in your brain. I think of them as windows. And if you open the window, whatever wants to come in can come in freely. Air, rain, snow, sleet, sunshine. When the female rat was stressed, all of these receptor molecules, windows, stayed wide open. And remember, as soon as the rat felt stressed, it poured out CRF. And therefore, all the CRF that surrounded the neurons went right into the cell, which increased the reactivity of the cell, made everything seem worse. Okay, got that? Up and down means yes. Now, in the male rat, something entirely different happened. So here is the stressed male neuron. You can see that there are receptor molecules, but see these little green things here? They're called arrestins. All right, female rat has arrestins. They're not doing diddly. They're just sitting there looking pretty. In the male brain, these arrestins start pulling in the receptor molecules, or if you use the window metaphor, they're slamming the window shut, so whatever's out there cannot come in. So here's one already in, one in and ready to be converted, another one coming in, and in general, the rat brains closed about half the windows. So they only took in half as much CRF. If you only have taken in 50% of that powerful substance, it ain't going to seem so bad. So the female's taken in 100% of what tried to get in. Males are only taking in half of that. So it tones down the whole sensitivity to stress. So when you understand that, it makes perfect sense why the couple that came to visit me, she is off the wall with stress. He goes, well, yeah, mom's difficult. I left home when I was 15, 17 because she was so difficult. But hey, how long can she live? Only half as stressful for him in the moment. And I told them, if you move her in, Give yourself a year or two, and there's really going to be problems. You're going to be stressed up the yin-yang because your wife won't be able to handle it. You know, how much is it going to cost to get her a small apartment? Well, he says, when you put it that way. So here's the comparison. Here's a female rat. All of the receptor molecules are open to CRF. Arrestins aren't doing anything. They're just sitting there. Here's the male rat. They're shutting at least half of the windows. So they only take in half of this powerful stressor. So keep that picture in your mind. Now, Deborah Van Gasser, who's a researcher who is doing a lot of research on male-female brains and stress, says that the female brain alarm system is even more sensitive to stressors and to CRF, period. Even in the absence of stressors, the female stress signaling system is more sensitive from the start. People will say to me, why do you think that is? And I go, I didn't do the design. I don't know. But if I were to take a guess, I would say that in most cultures, who's responsible primarily for taking care of the kids and all of the home stuff? It's primarily the female. And I'm telling you, kids are like little rugrats. You know, you can be looking right at them and turn around and look back and they're gone. And if her alarm system is more reactive, it's possible so she can maybe get a handle on that. I know what used to happen at our house. You know, I'd have to go out and speak one evening, and my husband would be taking care of the three boys, and I'd come home, and the place looked like a tornado had blown through. And I'd say to him, what in the world happened tonight? And he'll look around and he'll go, happened about what? You know, their shenanigans didn't bother him at all. He didn't even register them. And if a female had been there, believe me, she would have registered them. So, lack of receptor internalization, that's the research. All that means is there's nothing in the female brain to pull in the receptor molecules or slam the windows shut. Could translate into impaired ability to cope with high levels of CRF as occurs in depression and PTS. And it makes the event seem even worse in the moment. Now, the last 10 years I worked with a hospital system. I was dealing with people who had come back from the military with PTSD. About 20% of people who go overseas in the armed services will come back with PTSD. So a male can come back, and if he really wants to recover and will work with a therapist, he can resolve most of the problems of the PTSD in, I don't know, 9 months to 2 years, and stop the flashbacks and everything. When I retired from that job, we were still working with women who had been back from the military for 9 years, and they just could not seem to get a handle on the stress response related to PTSD. Just a whole different mechanism. Now, this increased receptor internalization, pulling in the receptor molecules, slamming the windows, causes in males to have the stressor seem not so bad at the moment, but it may be more problematic over time, increasing the male brain's risk for a major depressive event 25 years later. And that's what we're now seeing in males and females in terms of stress response. So the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, decided they wanted to look at this major depressive event in males 25 years later. They broke it out by gender and by race. So this first pass just looked at Caucasians versus Blacks. They're repeating it now with Asians. They plan to repeat it with Native Americans to see if the same thing is following. So when they looked at women, there was no difference for the risk of a major depressive event 25 years later based on race. Didn't matter your race. And when they did large sample interviews and so on, they concluded that women tend to use coping strategies such as relational connections. Remember, the average woman in the United States has how many people she can turn to? 9. Faith, religious affiliation or personal spirituality, social support networks, and they need to talk about it. They need to get it out in front of them so they can look at it and then let it go. So no difference for women. Didn't matter who they were. But then they found something that they have labeled the black-white paradox. Researchers found a stronger predictive role for, stressful life events and the risk of a major depressive episode for white males 25 years later. Not for blacks. So you black guys maybe ought to start teaching the white guys something, because they're the ones that are majorly at risk in 25 years. Despite higher levels of exposure to stressful life events, meaning that in a culture that is run by white males, anybody who isn't white, any female, and any male who isn't white finds it usually more stressful. So they have higher exposure to stressful life events, but completely disproportionately lower rates of depression. I find that fascinating. And the reason they think is because black males have a higher tendency to implement adaptive coping strategies, including hope, optimism, and so on. They usually have more male friends than Caucasian males, and they often are more involved in music. Have any of you ever been to New Orleans and gone to, I had it. Oh, there's a name there that is not coming to my mind at the moment. No. They've got a little jazz combo, and they start playing about 9 o'clock at night. It's standing room only, probably can only get 50 people in there. And you go early, you go about 8 o'clock, and you wait. And this particular Preservation Hall, I told my brain to tell me, Preservation Hall. Go to New Orleans, you gotta go to Preservation Hall. So I'm standing there, and 9 o'clock, the doors open, and here walk out these 5 black guys. And the first guy out is bent over like this with a cane, and he's walking like this. I'm going, man, I don't know where he's going, but I hope he can make it. And he arrives at the piano, and he sits down, and he drops his cane, and he hits the keyboard, and you'd think he was 25. I've never heard improvisation like that before. And the other guys gather around. I mean, there was a trumpet player and a, whatever. And they ask for selections from the audience. And the first thing somebody asked for was Amazing Grace. And the guy at the piano nods, and they hit it. And they played that song for 15 minutes with 15 different variations, and most of us were in tears. So they had a little question and answer period. And the guy at the piano was the spokesman. So they said to him, how long you been together? 82 years. 82 years. How old are you? 104. None of them are depressed. Have you ever seen a bunch of white guys, 84 to 104, getting together and playing soul so that everybody's crying regardless of skin color? Okay, of course they're going to have less depression. They got a support system. Music is rejuvenating for the brain and the body. I mean, if you white guys better take a lesson from this, because you're dropping like flies with major depressive disorders halfway through life. So, what are some of the conclusions of this study? You have got to manage stressors to which you are exposed. Stop exposing yourself to repeated, unpredictable stressors over which you have little, if any, control. So the biggest problem we have with women who have been battered, not that men aren't battered, but women who are battered, who are put in a shelter because they're bruised, broken bones, whatever. 3 months later, they're healed. You tell them they can be discharged. Where do they want to go? Back to where there were unpredictable stressors because they want to try to get it right this way as if it was their fault. And if you can't convince them not to go back, they have an 80% increased risk of being killed in one of these episodes. So women have to take a look at that. You can't fix everything. Do you live with an abusive rageaholic, or have you got one in your family? Try to stop exposing yourself to it. We had one in our family, and we started having Christmas dinner at a different time and didn't tell them when it was going to happen. A pattern of cheating, a relationship with an addiction, especially pornography. Jobs where a customer may lash out or slam the door in your face. I could never, ever be a door-to-door salesperson. Ever. Just my brain would not do that. First time somebody slammed the door, I would say, I think I'd rather be flipping hamburgers somewhere. A boss who flies into rages and demeans you. Family or friends who continually treat you badly. Your brain and body is leased to you on this planet. You're leasing a Rolls Royce. If you don't take care of that Rolls Royce, when you try to turn it in, you're going to have a big payment. A big payment. But we don't take care of this brain and body that was leased to us, often in these arenas, and it's lethal. So males, your strategies. Own that in general, you underestimate how bad something is. If you didn't, you would not be flocking to Pakistan. You have no idea how bad it's going to be, Iraq and those wars. And sometimes people can't wait to join up. You underestimate how bad it's going to be or how bad it really is. Own that. Learn to identify stressors in the moment as accurately as possible. Even if you don't feel like it at the moment, the females in your family may, and avoid blowing them off as if it's no big deal, because it is a big deal to them. Collaborate with a trusted female brain to get another perspective. You may never experience it in the way she does, but you can at least learn to understand how she is experiencing it. It will be different from you. Use what you learn to help her create and implement appropriate strategies, and then you do the same right now, even if you don't register them as all that serious, because it can help reduce your risk for a major depressive disorder in 25 years. So women, understand that in the short term, you tend to overreact to the stressor and think it really is worse than it is. You need to own that. Learn to identify them as accurately as possible and avoid overreacting and blowing them out of all proportion. because it's not as bad as you think it is. It's worse than your husband or boyfriend thinks it is. So you can do the same thing. You can collaborate with a trusted male friend and say, how do you view this? You know, how bad do you really think it is? And use what you learn to develop effective coping strategies. That's the beauty of understanding this and helping each other. So, is there danger being around people who are just vibrating with stress? Boy, but it's worse than we thought. So here it is. Studies have shown that stress can be transferred. Family members of those with PTSD sometimes show the same symptoms as those who have experienced the stress, but we haven't known how it impacted the brain. So this time, Nature Neuroscience published a study that used mice. Now, mice are also pretty good subjects. So what happened? When you had mice that were not stressed, they were living the life, there was comfortable, plenty of food, no danger. And then you had a group of mice that had been terribly stressed. You put the unstressed mice in with the stressed mice, and the non-stressed mice, their brains changed in the very same way as these poor little stressed mice. And the stressed mice and those indirectly stressed, they were just associating with them. When they sacrificed their brains and analyzed them, they showed the same changes in critical brain networks. Let me tell you, pastors are at high risk because hardly anyone ever comes into their office to say thank you. They come in because they're stressed. And so pastors really need to pay attention to this because I see them burn out. Because spending a lot of time with people who are very stressed is going to change your brain. Transmitted stress has the same lasting effects on glutamate synapses, meaning the spaces between the neurons, as authentic stress does. So glutamate is a really important amino acid, neurotransmitter. Too much of it can be toxic. And we see that with MSG. You know, when I'm traveling and go into a restaurant, the first thing I ask them, do you use MSG in anything? Because it will be very bad for my brain. And that's monosodium glutamate. Almost anything on a list of ingredients that ends in ATE you don't want. Now, so we got these mice. They weren't stressed. They associated with stressed mice. Their brains are very stressed. Social interactions helped female mice bounce back from the stress, and the affected neurons recovered by about 50%. 50% is not 100, but 50% is better than nothing. But social interactions did not help the affected neurons in the male mice brains bounce back and recover. So even if male brains think it's really no big deal, you better look at it, because interaction apparently doesn't help your neurons recover if they get badly stressed. So here's the last slide. We go back to the Apostle Paul, be anxious for nothing. No brain experiences stress symptoms until that brain says, oh, this is really stressful. So you can learn a different way to evaluate things. Epictetus, notice, 2nd century, lecturing at a university, and I said I just got back from Greece, and I learned about Epictetus and the stress reaction in one incomplete brain. Put up his hand and said, did you get to meet Epictetus? I now put 2nd century. Here's what he said and what now has been validated in research. Stressors interact with the brain in a predictable equation. Only 20% of any negative impact to your brain and body is due to the stressor. So sometimes things happen to me and I can't do anything about them because I didn't cause them. And it will do some negative impact to my brain and body. 80% of any negative effect to you is due to your perception of the event and how much weight you give to it. So you may not be able to do anything about the 20%. You can do everything about the 80% because your brain creates that. And it's become a fun journey for me to look at stressful events and see which part is the event and which part is me because of expectations, perceptions, whatever, that's making it seem worse than it really is. So that's the latest research I have to give you this trip. So I hope you've learned something and you will be able to put it into practice because it's changing my life. Thank you.
Did you get enough to eat today? A lot to process? Yeah, so we want to thank you, Dr. Register, Dr. Taylor. No, I was thinking about Dr. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking time again to come and to share with us. We always appreciate you coming and spending time to give us the latest research, and we look forward to you coming again. And I know that you're off. She's just got back from San Diego, Southern California last night, and she's going tonight, not home, but to Modesto to do another presentation. So tomorrow. So, man, life is good in retirement, right? That's great. So let me pray a blessing upon you and your ministry and upon us as we finish out a Sabbath and go start another week. So, Father God, Lord, we thank you so much for the opportunity to spend the whole day together and to learn about how our brain works and how best to handle stress, how to communicate with you, and how to interact with each other. And so for these things, Father, I just pray that now that we'll be able to have the strength and the understanding to put what we've learned into practice. And Father, we are so thankful for Dr. Taylor and her taking the time to come and spend with us. And so, Father, we want to pray a blessing upon her life and her ministry, that you continue to keep her safe, continue to bless her ministry. And Lord, we pray that she'll get to that 122 years and 165 days, Lord. So thank you for her, Lord, and bless her in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let me say one more thing. We're coming up to the holidays.
Yes.
It is whatever you decide it is. However, the suicide rate really goes up during the holidays. So I would suggest you take this information and you think ahead and you plan carefully what you want to do. And if you know something is stressful, nobody's going to hold a gun to your head to make you do it. And so if Aunt Tilly always comes spifflicated and slaps the kids and dumps the punch bowl, maybe you don't want to invite her. And that's not being unchristian, because you are responsible for, insofar as possible, protecting your brain and body from stressors. So think ahead.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Dr.